Well, hello, Mae. Welcome to another week of Dialogue Conspiracy. We've been getting mail.
Yeah, a lot of postcards.
Gonna answer some of them, I guess. People are being encouraged to write and ask questions or just comment and indicate that they're listening. And a lot of people are writing, and they're asking questions. And the address is Box 3904 in Carmel, California, if you have the desire to write. And if you put your address on it, you'll get a personal reply. Assuming Mae has enough time, and assuming that your question, warrants a reply, you'll get it.
And I'll answer some on the air, because whenever somebody has a question, it represents what a lot of people are thinking. Usually, Phil. In fact, there are two cards specifically that I want to talk about today. I just saw them when I came into the station. Somebody wrote and said, "I listened to your talk show every chance possible. Thank you for putting the facts of conspiracy in the news. So there's no excuse for people to say they never knew anything about the political overthrow that is going on." I appreciate that this person knows that even though we have news control by the major media, we've talked about this before on the show, that there is no excuse for people within range of my voice to not have an idea of some of the things I'm saying and to look them up. And if just one thing I say is right out of a whole hour show or out of a month's show, it should make people frightened and take some action. And I'm trying to give certain facts or information about our government. I made a big decision, Phil, I told you about this morning. We've been talking about conspiracy newsletter that I was going to do for Paul Krasner. The Realist was going to publish it. And I've been sitting for 2 weeks at my desk putting together the organization of the conspiracy, the overthrow of the government, trying to provide information for people. And I sat and looked at the massive amount of material that I've accumulated for 9 years in my research. And I had promised myself 2 years ago or 3 years ago, based upon 6 years research at the time, that I was going to leave the United States by the fall of 72. And I had my house up for sale, and there was the accident in the family. It delayed us. We had our papers filled out for another country. And I stalled things off, but I knew that I wanted to be out of this country, and I think I should go. So the conspiracy newsletter is off. I'm not going to publish it. I'll do separate articles for Paul and the Realist and for Computer and Automation and other publications. But it takes too much time for me to sit and write because I have a large house and a lot of things to pack up. So I'm going to start closing off my home and our things and getting things packed up, and I'm going to be out of the country in 2 months. I'm going to be away from here, and I'm going to leave it all to you lovely people. I'll write and send you messages. But I'm leaving, and I intended to leave 2 years ago, and I'm not going to sit with a typewriter. It'd be like somebody sitting in Nazi Germany in 1933, and they did this. Plenty of people did it, and they wrote letters about what was wrong with Hitler. And they stayed there so long and wrote so long that they were barbecued along with everybody else. There comes a point where you have to be objective about what the actual evidence is and not live in your fantasy that you can do everything that you want to do. If I've planted any seeds, in people's minds or any means of opening up ways to get information about the 1960s and 70s, I'm grateful for the chance on the radio program to do that. And that's the most I can do, and I'll keep doing it as long as I'm alive. But I owe it to my family, my children, and ourselves on the basis of what I know to get out of this country now. And, the shooting of Wallace was so contrived. We'll go into that a little more. And there's going to be more killings. There's going to be grenades and bombs going to go off in Congress. It's going to take a large amount of public officials, and a lot of repressions are going to come down. And I'm going to be out of here. And I think some of the show, or maybe all of it, I'm going to tell you the reasons I won't be here and why I think you should begin to do a little more serious investigation for your own lives, those who can't leave the country. One person wrote a card and said, "I listened to Dialogue Conspiracy, and I'm confused as to who is behind the conspiracy and its purpose." So I'll answer that. That's a good question. I rant with a lot of names and facts and information. Who is behind the conspiracy? A brief summary is this, if I can keep it brief. At the end of World War I, the Germans lost. They were very proud people. They believed in class system, slave labor, and the ruling classes. They were embarrassed by the defeat of World War I, the Germans were embarrassed by the defeat, and they weren't sorry for all the pillage and deaths that had happened. They were mad about losing the war. And at the same time that World War I was over, and Germany was ordered by the Versailles Treaty not to rearm again and cause a war on the soil of Europe like they had before. At the same time that World War I was over, the Soviet Union came into existence in those same years, and the communists took over the government. They took over the rich, noble oil fields that Rockefeller had his fingers in. John J. McCloy had large industries in Germany. The two members of the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles and John J. McCloy, were very heavy in protecting investments on the face of Europe. And everybody who had large economic holdings got nervous that their holdings could be overthrown by the masses, that someday the masses of people would catch on that a handful of people owned all the wealth, and that they would be overthrown like the Russians had been overthrown, the Tsar and his family. So America, the munition makers, oil, steel, the people who want to control the grease that runs the machinery of the nation, the industrial, the oil grease, it's really oil, that keep this nation going in terms of cars, factories, wealth. They rearmed Germany illegally, secretly, as a bulwark against communism that was in Europe. And the same lawyer, Alan Dulles, who represented the firm that financed Hitler, was sitting over in Switzerland at the time of World War II, and Alan Dulles was representing Rockefeller's holdings in Germany and all the American investments in Germany. Mr. Paley, Columbia Broadcasting System on the Board of Regents, University of California, owned hundreds of thousands of dollars, up to millions of dollars in Germany and in Europe in investment. And Mr. Dulles was sitting in Switzerland ostensibly for our OSS as a spy system. And he was meeting constantly with the top Nazis that Rockefeller and John J. McCloy had put into power as a bulwark against Russia. And before the war was over, no matter what Germany did to everybody in Europe, before the war was over, the top Germans were meeting with Alan Dulles to make a deal to come to this country and make the world headquarters of Nazism in the United States instead of in Germany. Because they knew at the end of World War II, we'd say you can't rearm again in Germany. So they went down to Jamaica, Tyrrell Club in Jamaica. The head of British intelligence in the United States met with Paul Rygotorodsky, John Conley, the Nazi head. His name is Paul Rygotorodsky. He's from Dallas, Texas. And these were wealthy people who owned the oil fields of Russia before the Bolsheviks took them. George de Mohrenschildt, the friend of Lee Harvey Oswald, his best friend, was of the noble oil family in Russia, the one that Rockefeller represented before George de Mohrenschildt was owned that oil, his family, before the Russians took it. And de Mohrenschildt was the one who got the job for the Oswald in the depository. See, I hit upon the world history. It's a long story. My research started with the witnesses before the Warren Commission who were talking about Lee Harvey Oswald being a misfit, a loner, a no-good bum, and we'll talk about that because Time magazine describes him again as being a pathetic loner. This week, May 29th, Time refers to Lee Harvey Oswald as a pathetic loner who is mentally disturbed. He was in correspondence with John Conley and all the top Nazis of our United States as an agent of Navy intelligence. And I began to cross-file the witness testimony before the Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. And a man would come by the name of Max Clark. And when Oswald came to Fort Worth from the Soviet Union, he right away picked up the phone and called Max Clark. Well, when I read the testimony of Max Clark, he's chief of Convair. He's the chief of intelligence at Convair, a large aircraft factory in the Fort Worth area. He was an FBI representative, and everybody Lee Harvey Oswald was with in the Dallas-Fort Worth area were espionage agents who were wealthy people who had land in the Soviet Union that they wanted a war against Russia. Again, to go back like Mr. Dealey and Dealey Plaza wanted Kennedy to have a war against Russia in 1960. George de Mohrenschildt had oil holdings. All these families that the Warren Report refers to as the white Russian community are wealthy people, and the Bolsheviks took their money. And this is why they had Oswald walking down New Orleans making a sign, you know, fair play for Cuba, or getting on a radio show. Oswald did a radio show and made a record with Ed Butler saying he was a Marxist. So the people would resent a Marxist killing our president. Ed Butler works for Patrick Frawley from Technicolor and Schick Razor. He helped put Richard Nixon in power. Ed Butler writes articles about Cali now, getting Cali out. He produces secret evidence that, Cali on the My Line to reduce the charges for Cali. Ed Butler is an employee of the far, far right wing in this country, and he worked with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. So getting back to what's behind the conspiracy, the paper this week explains it as clear as I could tell you on what was behind the whole conspiracy. There was an article June the 1st saying the U.S. is facing a squeeze as oil dwindles. And it says that eventually we're going to have to bring in oil for all of our energy in the United States, that we're using up a lot of the oil that we can produce. Alaska has 2 million barrels a day when they start moving it along. But we need 16 million barrels a day. And by 1972, it was estimated that we'd need 26 million barrels of oil. Well, the Monterey Herald had an article this week, and I wish
from the Associated Press.
Yeah, from the Associated Press. And I think if the people who listen to this show and take the show seriously go to your libraries and get the back issue, or go to the Monterey Herald. It's a small article, and it's dated June the 6th, 1972, and it's about the need of the Navy to develop a fleet to import oil. The article says, by 1985, we will need not only a huge fleet of tankers to import oil, but also a strong Navy to protect those ships, the Chief of Naval Material said. Now, I'm going to read this out, and I'm going to analyze it, because this is what the conspiracy is about. He said the Navy is developing plans for special aircraft-carrying vessels to convert convoys, such as tankers, in a low-threat intensity area where there'd be a possible war of interdiction or embarrassment at sea. Translated means that we're going to go overseas for our oil. We need oil. America's using up all the oil it has, and by 1985, we're going to have to import 50% of our oil. And our Navy is going to have to protect anyone who attacks us, who stops us from taking the oil from other shores. Now, that oil is going to have to come from Thailand, down New Zealand, Australia, all over the world. We are going to bring that oil, and we're going to use the armed forces to protect it. Now, see, Nixon went to China, and he stopped in Hong Kong, and one of his speeches was that the right of each nation should be able to determine its own destiny. In other words, Connolly's going all over the world now in every oil country. He steps down from the Secretary of Treasury, which is the third or fourth most important job in the United States, to make oil deals. He'll go to Venezuela, and he's making a deal for oil. He's going to 15 oil stops. And the point is that if Venezuela has oil, the oil doesn't go back to the Venezuelans for hospitals, schools, roads, education, colleges. What's going to happen is the oil is going to America, and the Venezuelans can go to hell. And the top leaders will live well because they're making a deal. The book, I'm jumping around a lot, but I want to bring a certain points clear. Reinhard Gehlen, who is chief of all Nazi intelligence of the Eastern Division under Adolf Hitler, had the intention to go right into Europe and make 40 million people slaves immediately, and another 40 million were to be killed as soon as they won that war with Russia. Now, they had no compunction. They were going to round them up. They figured the best way to kill 40 million was simply to starve them. Put a big fence around it and supply no food, and they wouldn't even bother the gas chambers. And Reinhard figured that that was the best thing to do, and then import the rest of the people as slaves to run the industrialization of Europe. Now, everywhere they conquered, this was the Nazi intention. This is the plan now, Connolly, wherever he goes. A few people in Thailand or Vietnam will run each country like 22 families ran Pakistan. And the oil will come to America in exchange for the rulers of each country making their people slaves. We'll pull the oil because America has to have that oil. And the people who allow us to have it will be as rich as some Americans, and the rest will never get the oil, the benefit of the oil, in their own economy. The article goes on to say that Admiral Kidd, a former commander of the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, was talking at the Edison Electric Institute convention. Now, this is power, is what the Warren Commission is about. The killing of Kennedy is the problem, that John Kennedy was going to let some people determine their own destinies. And he said it loud and clear, just like the CIA gave him orders to go into Cuba. He did not go into Cuba, and he did not allow Castro to be killed. He had a big fight with Governor Smathers of Florida, who later became senator. He wanted Castro killed. Kennedy said he has a right to live and have his system, and we'll have ours. Kennedy, there was no guarantee that he would have taken orders to escalate Vietnam. None at all, even though people think that he's responsible as much as Eisenhower or Johnson. That's not true. If he didn't take orders on one thing, it's not proof that he would, that's proof that he might not take them on another. But power, the Edison Company is where this man talks, because electric power and oil is what it's about. The article goes on, the National Petroleum Council says that by 1985, imported oil will account for 50% of American needs. Now, here is the important part about the article. The United States, he says, is making ready now to build 1,450 tankers of 80,000-ton variety to handle the importing chores. But, he says, they need a Navy. The United States is making the tankers to bring the oil, but they're going to need a Navy to guard those tankers against any actions that are formulated by whim or spur-of-the-moment national policy in our country. No matter who runs for president, like the government gets in, or no matter who gets in, he calls that a spur-of-the-moment national policy, because the Council of Foreign Relations and the National Security Council have decided what they're going to do. And anyone who bucks them, they're not going to kill everybody, but they're going to take that oil. And no spur-of-the-moment national policy, he says, or the urging of some big brother is going to stop us. Now, in summary, what this commander is saying of the Navy is that they're developing the vessels and the ships to protect the actual robbery of the resources of any nation. Our, weapons, missiles, atomic bombs, will use any means necessary. We're going to take that oil because this country needs it. I have a friend who's over in Europe who attended a conference in one of the countries of members of European nations. And they began, this is the way the conference went, they began talking about use energy. It was called the Conference on Energy, that we used to use slaves and animals. And then we went into, wheels and machinery, and then electric power, now oil. And they said, we need oil. This was about 4 weeks ago that I got this tape about this particular conference. And then he came out and said, we need the oil, and we're going to get it, because that's the way we run. Our machinery runs, our government runs. Therefore, we will send more people into South Africa, into Arabia, into New Zealand, into where the natives are, and we will take over these countries because we need that oil. And they were very clear about it, outspoken, and they're a group that are very European, and they don't give a bean, about the nationals or the individual nations. And that was a few weeks ago that I got this tape, and now there's an article saying we're going to get the oil. Now, that's what the killing of Kennedy was about. The men who sat on the Warren Commission, John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles, represent tremendous oil firms, lawyers for oil firms and other minerals. There's all kinds of minerals that control the world, but the oil is the important thing. Rockefeller, his attorney was John Mitchell. And there's a very close link between John Mitchell, John Conley, the Texas oil people, and so forth.
So they're for George in Santa Cruz is the answer to his... That's the short answer to your question, George.
Do you think I answered? I
think so. If not, George will be writing you again.
He asked
George in Santa Cruz.
Yeah, he said he's confused who is behind the conspiracy and its purposes. The National Security Council, the Foreign Relations Committee in New York, that meet their little private little clubhouse, they're made up of people who control the oil of the world, and they're not going to have any man for president who throws away the opportunity to continue controlling the oil.
Now, was it last week, Mae, that
last week
you mentioned that there was a brand new constitution set up to be implemented if there were overwhelming domestic problems that necessitated restructuring the government quickly?
I said that the government for 6 years has been planning, came out with a new constitution. Yeah.
And lo and behold, you brought
I kept my
a comparison of the new constitution in, and wow, I was looking at it before we went on the air. And maybe we can go over this and discuss it. Maybe since all I have to do is read, maybe I can just bring up some of these points
here.
You
can bring up some of these points about the new constitution. Let me explain that there are a lot of things that get in the news that affect your lives if you want to read it out there. You know, like this person said, nobody can say we don't have the facts. The difference between my research and a lot of other people's is that when I see these things, I put them in a filing cabinet and save them. And I promised I'd bring in this article, Phil, but I didn't realize this article is from the New York Times in 1970, and we'll read it, and you can read some of this. But the man who wants to do away with trial by jury, who got that into the new Constitution, is Warren Burger, now Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He visited the center out in Santa Barbara that drew up this new Constitution that we may need, because he says 1970 and 1970s, it's outdated to have the old Constitution. It was Warren Burger who came out to Santa Barbara and said that the guarantee of trial by jury in an adversary trial, it slows the wheel of justice and the adversary system. That it requires a formal case with two opponents, but it does not necessarily produce justice. Now, Phil, you can read some of this Constitution, but before you listeners just shake your heads and say this will never happen, let me tell you that after working on this for 6 years, almost all the colleagues at the Center in Santa Barbara approved of this Constitution. It took 6 years to write. They approved of it. And the man who came out to see them, who added the worst clauses in it, is the Justice of the Supreme Court right now. Read a few of the proposals, Phil. It makes me sick to read them. You take over.
Well, the present Constitution, as it's structured now, has a United States of America composed of sovereign states. There are now 50 of those states, with all powers not delegated to the national government reserved to the states. Under this proposed Constitution, it is the United Republics of America, a nation divided into not more than 20 republics, with each republic containing no less than 5% of the nation's population. Powers similar to the states' powers are granted to the republics, whose governments may be removed by the National Senate or for corruption or ineptitude. The National Senate is something that's interesting, too, because let's jump down to the National Senate. The Senate we have today is two persons from each state elected for 6-year terms. The National Senate under this new Constitution, which we're not making up, by the way, this was made up for us and published in the New York Times.
It's like the War of the Martians that Orson Welles did.
And the National Senate would serve for life. For life. It's composed of former presidents, vice presidents, and other former high public officials, plus some members selected by the president, judiciary, and House of Representatives. This Senate would have power to object to any measure approved by the House except the annual budget. And then, of course, we had mention of the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives would be similar to the present House, except that it would have 400 members, with 100 elected at large and the rest from districts. Also,
how do you like?
Also, the seniority system of selecting committee chairman would be eliminated, and no chairman could serve longer than 6 years. Now, that doesn't sound like a bad idea.
Well,
but that may be the only part of it that doesn't. Then we go down here to the judicial system. The Supreme Court is abolished, and its powers divided among a High Court of the Constitution, a High Court of Appeal, and special courts of claims, rights and duties, administrative settlements, tax appeals, and arbitration review. The principal justice, replacing the office of Chief Justice, would be chosen for a term of 12 years. The High Court of the Constitution must advise the Senate on the constitutionality of questionable measures passed by the House. If the High Court declares a law unconstitutional, the Senate may overrule the decision. The Senate really has the power here.
See, the Senate isn't elected. It's only, it's military people. It's appointed. The Senate makes every decision.
Yeah, the Senate is selected by the President, the Judiciary, and the House.
And it stays there for life.
And their term is for life. Now, the President is not elected for life. The President is elected to one 9-year term unless he's rejected by the electorate after 3 years. He has no responsibility over administrative agencies, but concentrates his efforts on foreign affairs and foreign policy.
He's going to be there for life. In 9 years means that he doesn't have to account to anybody. Their explanation was that the president then doesn't have to account to people, so he can make decisions that he wants that aren't fly-by-night pressures. That's like in Greece.
Now, we are reading, in case you're wondering, from the proposed United States, or United Republics of America Constitution to replace the Constitution, which is in effect now. As far as elections go, an electoral branch would oversee the organizations of parties, nominations, and elections, campaign funds, codes of fair practice, etc. As you establish an electoral branch. This is opposed to where national parties weren't even contemplated in the Constitution that we have now.
Yeah.
And the elections were left to be conducted by the states.
But don't forget, with your House of Representatives, so you have 100 elected at large, and the rest from districts. The whole electoral thing is selected, actually, then by the Senate. Their committees are going to make up everything.
Yeah, the Senate's
making up
the Senate turns out to be all the former presidents and vice presidents.
And military advisors, yeah. And
that's your Senate.
They control the election, the financing, who's to run, which candidates.
There are a couple other minor provisions in here, planning agency and regulatory agencies, and then you get down to the Bill of Rights. And, of course, the first 8 amendments to the Constitution now state fundamental liberties of citizens that may not be infringed upon by the government. Under this new Constitution, there is no Bill of Rights.
Completely gone.
None whatsoever. But the fundamental safeguards included in various portions are virtually identical to the present ones. There are some notable differences, though. There's no right to trial by jury, which Chief Justice Berger was responsible for.
You do away with the Bill of Rights, and you do away with the trial by jury.
Right to trial by jury, and there also is no right to bear arms. The National Rifle Association will be grieved to hear that.
Well, no, they won't, because they will get permission. You see, like in Greece, Greece was overthrown. All arms were called in. Yeah, I mean, the Rifle Association may have a fuss about, like, I'm sure there are people in Greece that wanted their arms for hunting. But in order to protect this new Senate and this new system, you have to pull in all the arms before you have another revolution.
There is also a prohibition against unlicensed possession of lethal weapons.
Yeah. They're going to make sure you don't get... This is why Greece has been overthrown for 5 years. There's no way to get back, because you can't even, except with matches, there's no way that you can fight them now, the tanks and so forth, No, that's the new Constitution. And then, as I say...
The way it can be amended, too.
No.
Let's get on to that in a minute when we'll break the station. Amendments to this new Constitution can be proposed by a council of top judges, approved by the President and the Senate, ratified by the majority in national elections, and after 5 presidential terms, the entire Constitution may be rewritten and submitted to ratification by majority in national election, the election of which is overseen by the electoral branch, the electoral branch which is overseen by the Senate. So all in all, you got to really... That is the new Constitution for the United States that could be implemented. It's all prepared and ready to go if it can be put through. Now, we'll break the station and identify this and then come back and talk about the man who wrote this up. This is Dialogue Conspiracy, and the station is KLRB FM, Carmel, 24 hours a day. So we were talking about a brand new Constitution for the United States that has been prepared.
One president for 9 years. The Senate's appointed. 2 vice presidents. You forgot to mention that. There's going to be two vice presidents
right,
that would supervise affairs. Now, I think that Conley and Agnew, if this new Constitution would go in, if Nixon is in and isn't killed, then Conley and Agnew could be the 2 vice presidents. If he's killed, you could make Conley the president, Rockefeller and Agnew. They're grooming for this position. You've got some top men there, see?
I think Martin and Lewis might.
Martin and Lewis. But you had 2 vice presidents, a Senate that's appointed, and the end of the Bill of Rights.
This is not just something that's drawn up overnight by some 12th grade government classes.
No, and I want to emphasize this point, that a Mr. Tugwell, who worked with Roosevelt under Roosevelt's administration, worked with him, who taught economics at the university, Columbia University in New York. His name is in front of this, although the whole group of commission worked on this. His name goes to this new study on the Constitution. And Rex Tugwell said that institutions no longer serve the needs of modern society any more than totem poles, that our traditional Constitution doesn't serve the needs of a modern society. Translated, it means if you're going to stop us from getting the oil and the gold and all the things we need and get yourselves an education and question who runs this system, then we've got to change the rules of the game. We've got to change our rules, because a modern society needs oil, it needs imperialism, it needs slave labor. And if you're going to change the rules, if all those blacks are going to come up from the South and begin the civil rights thing and want fair housing and all the advantages that America could offer them, we're going to change the rules of the game. So he says there was a new charter made for modern America. The basis of Mr. Tugwell's political theorem is his conviction, I read this from the New York Times, is his conviction that representative democracy is not only compatible with government planning, but it may not survive without it. That in order to have a representative democracy, that you have to come in now and bring a new type of constitution, meaning that a representative government will be one who looks over the interests of the country, and the interest of the country is to maintain the economy. That's the way he figures it out, see. So then he says that if he's successful in getting this Constitution through, his firm belief that the existing charter that we have of the Constitution in America is outgrown, that if he's successful, it would be through his work and the other people who helped him write it, and that he had help in writing this, that most of the colleagues agreed that this was a good Constitution. And I repeat that Warren Burger, who was not yet, this was before his appointment as Chief Justice, argued to do away with the trial by jury. And that's where Mr. Burger's head is at. Along with the new Constitution, I brought in the plan to revise the cabinet. Now, it's very important to see who's doing all this. If these were just people off in some strange land, it would be different. Roy Ash, I've mentioned his name several times on the shows, is the head of Litton Industries, and that was the organization, the conduit of funds that overthrew Greece and helped it become a fascist dictatorship. And Roy Ash is designing the cabinet, which is identical to Greece, just like this Constitution is like Greece. They can't bear arms, and there's no trial by jury, and the head of the government can run 9 years, and there's no court, you see. So we're making provisions to legalize what they did. You see, I know the government here was overthrown in 1963 in Dallas. Now they're pulling in all their laws to have the same effect they had in Greece, and the same men that overthrew Greece are designing our cabinets. Now, in 1971, there was an article, it was in February 71, that Roy Ash was planning a whole revision, a government reorganization for President Nixon, but he wouldn't bring it out in an election year because people might not like it. So, when I talk about leaving the United States, I don't want to be around after the next election because I have hundreds of articles like this. I'm just bringing in the Constitution, the cabinet. This Ash-type commission is working under presidential guidelines. That means that Mr. Nixon is helping him do that. And he said this prestigious commission might enhance Nixon's chance of making reform an issue for re-election, but they're not going to announce it till after the election. See, they're going to say, we have major reforms planned, but we're not going to announce them. Now, the plan that I talked about once before, twice on the show, was that the only branches of the government, the only cabinets, would be the Department of State, then I put that under, Kissinger or Rockefeller, Department of the Treasury, Department of Defense, and the Department of Justice. Now you have, those are the four most important things, your law courts and your surveillance, your police system, your data banks, all goes under justice, surveillance, and so forth, because anybody who questions the legality of the existing state is an enemy against the state, too. The Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, this is defense to be in Vietnam. There was an article last week about doublethink language, and there's an Institute of Teachers that are coming out with a study where they're asking people to analyze the words that we're reading and turn in words where we have what they call doublethink, like 1984. And one example was we had the War Department until, 1945 or 47. It was called the War Department. And then we turned to the Department of Defense and started making these gigantic weapons that we're using now, like the napalm that burned all those kids.
We should have a Department of Offense.
Yeah, Max. Then there's the Treasury that controls all the money and the taxes and the means of making war, and this Department of State that decides which countries you recognize, whose oil you take, and these two. Now, what they're going to do away with entirely are the other departments of the cabinet that we've had all these years. This proposal, I'm reading from, this is the Washington Post, 1971. This proposal of President Nixon, it was designed by Roy Ashe, and Secretary of the Treasury John Connally said the chances of passing this are very good. Here's your John Connally, the oil Connally again. Connally said that Roy Ashe, President of Litton Industries and Chairman of the Commission that recommended these changes, would save us $5 billion a year. We've spent that in the last couple of weeks in Vietnam. Now here, the proposal would do away with Department of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health, Education, Welfare, Housing, Urban Development, and Transportation. That's the United States of America you're going to have. And in here, their places, they would condense 4 departments under the State, Treasury, Defense, and Justice. And the excuse would be to save money. If you read what the space shuttle is costing, just that trip, they can make 100 trips for a handful of men to get to the moon, which is going to cost $52 billion. This is what he said. By eliminating these departments, we can have a space shuttle for 30 men to take maybe at the most 100 trips to space. By eliminating every one of these, so that you're taking away all protections for land and recreation, water resources, energy and mineral resources, marine, atmospheric, terrestrial resources, technology, Indians, and territory. I'm listing these, every one of them, because these are things you have in America, and if you don't know what you're going to lose, you don't know what the assassination of John Kennedy was about. This is what it's all about. We're going to do away with the health services. When I say do away, they're going to be under the control of the president and nobody else, and he's elected 9 years. And the appointed past presidents and military decide who is nominated for president. They decide the electoral system and what money. They'll decide the candidate and the president. All of these account to nobody but that man, not to any other department. Health service, income maintenance, your security, education, manpower, that goes into your slave, social and rehabilitation services, food and commodity, domestic and international commerce, science and technology. Here you can read some of these, Phil. Here's some more departments of the, starting with the labor. These are to be eliminated. They only account to the president.
Let's see.
I left off with labor and
labor relations standards.
Labor.
Aren't these under four other departments that they're going to create that would be directly under the president? The Department of Economic Affairs is something we don't have now, and Department of Community Development we don't have now.
We have those things down there like health, education.
Different name, yeah.
The reason I'm reading the list is that all of the things that we have are broken down into separate cabinets. If there's a health, education, and welfare, and a man like, say, Mr. Panetta, who lives on the Monterey Peninsula, worked for Nixon, and he left that administration and says the minorities aren't getting a fair shake, and he comes home and speaks about there won't be such groups. The president will decide what is for you to do, and he decides it now. A man that works for him comes home and says, no, this system isn't working. The point I'm trying to make is that all these different branches are under the jurisdiction of only the president, and you can't complain. If the president is selected by the Senate and the Senate is appointed by former people who've proved where their head is at, then none of these things like housing, highway, mass transit, there's no one that's going to represent you if a freeway goes right through the middle of your town, like the process that we have now. We speak up radios, a lot of noise, and sometimes we divert the freeway, and sometimes we don't. But we have a 50-50 chance, or even 5 chances out of 100, But all of this, insurance programs and everything, will be under the supervision of the president.
I wonder if people would be interested in having copies of these articles.
Well, if they want them, Phil, all they have to do is go to the library. They have microfilm of the New York Times.
This is September 7th.
September the 8th, 1970. Okay. If anyone has an interest in this, the libraries have microfilm of the New York Times, or you can write to the New York Times and get a copy.
Well, the Los Angeles Times had an article on this, too, on September 13th, 1972.
A lot of newspapers had an article about the Constitution, a few of them when it came out. But this is an interesting thing. You read an article, and it doesn't stay in your head. But the way I do my research, and I've mentioned this before, I put in columns. And by putting it in columns, you get a clearer picture. So the article in the New York Times has a list what our present Constitution is, and then on the other side they have what they would do away with. And that's why it's easier to take notice of the intent and of Warren Burger's position about no trial by jury. I was doing some work this week writing about President Nixon and his political career on the past political assassinations and why every single one of them, 3 murders and 2 accidents, served only one purpose, and that was Richard Nixon. And I was writing that Patrick Gray III went to Annapolis, and he had a Navy career, 20 years, and he left that career in the Navy to help work on Nixon's campaign in 1960. So he knew Nixon was going to go somewhere. And Mr. Patrick Gray is acting head of the FBI now, and he says, to be head of the FBI isn't a political position. I'm not political. And yet he left a full-time Navy career to work in Nixon's campaign, to give up an Annapolis training to run a presidential campaign. Now, getting back to that world, did you have some question, Phil?
Well, I was going to bring up somebody else who left a job to work on a campaign,
Mitchell.
John Mitchell, and what happened Thursday with Richard Kleindienst.
Yeah. You see, John Mitchell, if he's going to give up one of the most important jobs in the United States as head of the Justice Department and run Richard Nixon's campaign, how can he be objective about a Justice Department, and what's going on in the Justice Department? One of the things that is important to remember is that the White House was totally controlled by the oil people and the mineral people. John Foster Dulles called himself the man who could control Eisenhower. Allen Dulles was described in a recent book by Cookridge, the book on Reinhard Gehlen, as he described Allen Dulles as being the 3rd most important man in the world. He was on the Warren Commission. He combined agencies of our Central Intelligence Agency with all German intelligence, and they controlled the White House. They had Eisenhower out playing golf, and Richard Nixon was their selected agent for 8 years, sitting in a seat where they made every decision of foreign aid or what country was an enemy, who was our friends, what to do with our economy. Well, in 1960, when Nixon ran against Kennedy and lost, the provision was made to get rid of Kennedy right then. And my research is different than the other people who do their work. They think that one of the reasons for killing Kennedy was an anger by the people at the Bay of Pigs because he pulled back. And my research indicates that the decision to kill Kennedy was made in 1961. It was probably made when Johnson accepted the vice presidency, because John Connally was his campaign manager. And again, all that oil of Texas was not going to go to the Kennedy family for sure, and not the family, but the man who was going to change country and give it to the youth the opportunity to make their own decisions. So John Kennedy was killed, and on the Warren Commission was John James McCloy and Allen Dulles and a lot of people. One of the men on the Warren Commission was Gerald Ford, who was very angry that the new bill that went through this week of education didn't get all of the anti-busing he wanted on it. He didn't want the busing thing, and he's been wanting to make Vietnam a parking lot for the past 10 years with atomic bombs. And Dick Russell of Georgia, everyone on that Warren Commission was pro-Vietnam, pro-military, anti-civil rights, every single member of the Warren Commission. So they controlled the White House with Nixon sitting there. And with Johnson coming into office was not a change of administrations, because Johnson and Nixon and Rockefeller were all part of a team. And so in 1968, when Bobby came along, you didn't have to wait for an inauguration. They just weren't going to have him around. And as soon as he won the primary, the provisions were made, take him away, which they did. And in 1969, it seemed that the only man who could defeat Richard Nixon in 72, according to articles I was saving in even then, was going to be Ted Kennedy. And that wasn't based on any of Ted's political astuteness. It was sort of an emotional guilt that the nation was feeling, I think, a national guilt, that they knew something was wrong and felt pretty bad about it, and they'd give him a chance. So they didn't wait until a primary or an inauguration. They gave him a dunking arranged by the CIA up at Chappaquiddick. There's books coming out on Chappaquiddick, a lot of research. The truth isn't told about that at all. And in case, the American people didn't buy that story about the dead girl, the chick, and the frame-up. And nobody really knows the details, but nobody cared. It didn't have the effect it was going to have. So Time magazine this last week said, look what happened to Wallace, that if Kennedy wants to run, that's suicide. They've told him, look what happened to Wallace. So then along comes Nixon, and he's removed his competition for 1972, but he didn't anticipate the popular appeal of George Wallace. There was no way 3 years ago to predict that a populist person would make a dent in that Southern strategy that Mitchell had designed. They knew they'd lose the youth votes because they don't intend to end Vietnam. We escalated with troops going into North Vietnam. We bombed harder and farther north. We're blowing up the dikes. We're dropping napalm. That war, no matter how much you people protest or listen or sign your little petitions, everyone comes around, have you signed the air war petition? That's not where it's at. I meet more people and say, did you sign the marijuana thing? Did you sign the air war? You are losing your time. You're wasting your lives. I cut out an article last Sunday's paper. It says the increased bombing in Vietnam cost this government $15 to $20 million every single day. This was the accounts last week. And Laird said we have to have a new increase of $42 billion because of the expense of bombing Vietnam. I want to say that the killing of all these different people was systematically planned to keep the power in the same hands, the same Nazi American hands, the same people that financed Hitler, brought hundreds and hundreds of his agents over to this country. There's people over at the Presidio School teaching German, paid by you taxpayers, who have an airplane hanging there with Nazi swastikas on their desk, who were members of the SS troop of Hitler. And they're teaching over at the Presidio.
No, I mean, really?
Yes, I could read the list. I'll give you a name. I have a list at home of the names of the teachers. And when the students say to them over at the Presidio, what about Hitler, and the war, and they say Hitler was right, and they have German swastikas on their desk and members of the SS troop of Hitler teaching German on the Monterey Peninsula. Imports. That's, you sign an air war petition to people in the area where I speak, like Santa Cruz, Salinas, and Carmel. Why don't you sign a petition to get those Nazis out of this country and really sit down with a book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and realize that the incorporation of those Germans into this country is not going to end this war. Reinhard Gehlen, who wanted to make 40 million slaves and 40 million dead, he's doing that in Asia. He's alive. He worked with Allen Dulles. He formed our whole CIA with Richard Helms. That's what's happening. Getting back to the chronology of Nixon, he designed the Southern strategy. I have a whole book on it. They didn't anticipate Wallace. And Wallace all of a sudden surfaced. So on the eve of his primary, he caught them by surprise. Wallace was shot. I brought in a newsletter. I bring up this subject many times. Joe Justine in Germany is a writer who wrote many books on government and history in Germany before Hitler took over. He's a man about 75 years old. And after the war, he came back to writing books in Germany. And the minute John Kennedy was killed, he understood history. He's much older than me, and he could look back and see what happened then and could see who was moving the decisions about the commission and so forth. But before the commission it was appointed in December, I guess about that date, he came right out to Dallas from Germany, went back to Germany and wrote a book called Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy. And it's a very good book. Then he wrote another book on Lyndon Johnson, and he wrote one on, he wrote about the oil people, and he's written 7 books on the political assassinations. And he has a newsletter. If you want to subscribe to it, it's kind of expensive, but it's a beautiful newsletter, and it comes out every 2 weeks. And he has 4 pages that are continuous subjects, and you take them apart, and they're books at the end of the year. He sells them as books, and you can save them. And the last one just came this week. It's dated June the 1st, and that came from Germany. His address is 7890 Gutenberg, Germany. Joesten is his name. He has a longer name, Joachim. I don't know the German pronunciation. But this is what he wrote in his newsletter that came over here. And when I got it, I just finished writing an article called The Stage is Set, to the effect that now that Wallace has been shot, get ready for the big surprises. And his wording was almost identical. I just completed writing one article, and this is the way Justine wrote it. He says, that, in quotes, the shooting of George Wallace was nothing but the eye-catching prelude to a more important devilry planned by the CIA to save the Nixon maladministration from disaster. It says it was a diversionary maneuver of wide scope for the American public in advance, so they won't recognize the second coup d'etat in the making. He refers to the first coup d'etat where the government was overthrown in Dallas, and then the second coup d'etat is going to be the one where they take their total fascist control. I just finished writing the article, and I referred to the baby coup of 1963 and the Big Daddy coup of 1972. The Big Daddy coup is going to where this Constitution gets in, where the cabinet gets in, but the baby coup was the little one in Dallas where they switched their hands, but all the wheels weren't tightened like we have them now, you see. The Nixon regime, he said, is supported by oil, corporate giants who are committed to self-preservation. He said Nixon used to be the international outlaw par excellence, and now he's the nation's #1 outlaw for arranging the Wallace shooting, the Wallace killing. He says, like, the CIA and Nixon are closer than anybody could imagine, and again, the CIA set up the assassination attempt on Wallace. Now, if you don't believe that these things are possible, there was an article this week in the LA Times about the new director of the FBI, and it tells how the FBI went into the case of the shooting of Wallace. I'll do this one next week on the show, but it says Arthur Bremer went into a hospital to have some stitches taken care of when he was hurt at the shopping center. He went in with a policeman into the hospital, and he came out a suspect of the FBI, that they took him over. And he went in the hospital as a county prisoner, and he came out as part of the FBI. And on one of the shows I mentioned how he needed medical care, and Nixon and the Justice Department sent word to Maryland he can have medical care if an FBI man is there, present in the room. So this article by the author's name is TRB. He uses those initials. It says the only suspect in the scene was hurt in the crowd, and he went to the hospital as a county prisoner, and the FBI took care of him. Now, it said the FBI went to Bramer's car and found nothing in the car but a lot of clutter and belongings, see? And they said, there's nothing here, it's okay. Then the policeman in Maryland went in the car and found a gun hidden in the door. And it said the FBI, this Pat McGree III, who's going to be the head of the FBI, has closed the case and didn't even want to, the gun was inside the door. The police in Maryland found it later, and Gray said, and his officer said there's nothing in the car. That's the way they did at Dealey Plaza. There's photographs of them picking shells up off the grass at Dealey Plaza and putting them in their pocket, and saying that they're, you know, one of the things that Sprague showed was one of the agents going on the ground, picking up something and putting it in his pocket. Really cool, like, you know. So the FBI didn't find this big gun that was in at the door of the car. So Justine claims that the public agencies, I use that as an example and get off from his newsletter, because this is, in fact, what is happening. So he says the Wallace made himself expendable to people like Nixon, and he was, in fact, he says, an expendable decoy. He was usurping what was going to happen in the country. And he said, you know, he talks about Humpty Dumpty, Laird, and all the other people who put up a pretense of an electoral system. But Wallace was an expendable decoy because he was a nuisance lately, and they could use him. The phony story circulated by Newsweek and newsfakers, Justine says, according to Bremer, that he wanted to assassinate the great Richard Nixon himself before he settled for Wallen, was an extra dividend they threw in. He said, remember we talked about that? He says that was an extra dividend. Nixon is an old hand at rigging up phony assassination attempts about himself. You know, he had those cars thrown at Venezuela and so forth. Well, he goes on to the whole, it's a long article. There's so much to cover in the news, you know, these days. It's a whole long article on Bremer at the Waldorf Astoria and the connection, you know, with the CIA. And it says the next installment in the CIA's chain of political murders is in the making. The next lonely misfit is standing by for instructions, and you have to be dumb and blind not to see the handwriting on the wall. And who's going to be the next victim? Well, it could be anybody. It could be that poor pompous slob Spiro Agnew waiting in the wings to take his place. Or the revenge could be on McGovern or Kennedy, or simply cancel the elections. He says this isn't the exact scenario, but the Nixon gang is working, and it's bound to be doing something. You want to read this? Yeah.
This is interesting here from
Yeah.
his newsletter, quoting the London Daily Mail of May 16th, 1972. Police said the suspected gunman did not act alone. They started an intensive hunt in Maryland for a blue Cadillac with Georgia license plates. And Justine says, now here you have a good hot lead pointing to a getaway car. The number of blue Cadillacs registered in Georgia can't be astronomical. Far less concrete evidence would enable a competent law enforcement agency to track down Bremer's accomplice. So what happens? The FBI takes over, easing the local police out, and presto, there's no evidence of conspiracy. On the other hand, the Sunday Times of May 21st, that's the Sunday Times in London of May 21st, after a lot of research by two of its top reporters, came up with a series of startling facts which show beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bremer, though he had no job and had been loafing for at least 4 months, was well equipped with cash. According to Time, Bremer in 1971 had earned $1,611, which is hardly the stuff Justine says sizable nest eggs are made of. Yet, after having quit work, Bremer miraculously was able to A, buy a 1968 model blue Rambler, B, rent a $135 apartment in Milwaukee, C, crisscross the United States for 4 months, covering many thousands of miles, and D, stay for 2 nights at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, where a single room costs at least $35 a night. It was a good thing, Justine says, that the American press lightly skipped this extraordinarily revealing item, for otherwise people might have started to wonder where all that money came from.
Well, another point which I made to send to Joe Justine in Europe, I made a letter out this week, was not only did they have a lead on that blue Cadillac in Maryland, I don't know if we mentioned this last week, they had a 6'2" gentleman who weighed 220 pounds who was driving the blue Cadillac. But up in Milwaukee, the man at the ferry boat crossing said that Bremer was with a good husky man who was 6'2", 225 pounds. Now, in the interim, since we were on the show last week, where you had a man, the exact description given at 2 different places, and one had been let go as a suspect, the case was closed by the FBI. They didn't even bring those 2 people in, and we didn't hear what floor he stayed on or who he saw in New York. The suspect up in Milwaukee had a New York accent. The case is closed with no evidence. I don't know if I have time to read it quickly.
No, not
no,
really.
but time's out. We'll do it next week.
Time's up.
Yeah.
One thing we could mention, though, is another letter that you received at the station here concerning some envelopes that state on they're black mailing envelopes, and they state in mourning for one lost in Vietnam or something like that. And one of our listeners asked if we could maybe mention that.
Maybe they could make envelopes for us that are more inclusive. You know, maybe I should write to her and have her design an envelope for. You see, she's talking about Vietnam, and she wants to end the war in Vietnam. Our government allowed 100,000 people to be killed in Burundi. 150,000 since April. The Watusi tribe, which holds like 12% of the government, allowed these natives to be slaughtered because they felt the oppression there. You see, the problem is genocide in Brazil, defoliating 10% of the Earth's oxygen and putting concrete down in Brazil. It isn't just Vietnam. I object to people saying, I don't want this jelly or this electric bombing there, when the total thing is that the people in power have murdered our electoral system and murdered the candidates, and until you get them out of power, you can't effect the bombing. It's such a small part of the actual killing of your candidates.
Part of the picture.
Yeah.
Anyway, if anybody's interested in those envelopes, they're $25 for $1, and you can get them at Bookshop Santa Cruz or at the bookstore up on the UC Santa Cruz campus. So there, we mentioned it, and hope you'll consider that.